Hello, everybody. Good afternoon and good morning to some folks. Really great to be with you again. My name is Maddie Day, and I am moderating today's webinar. Just really quickly want to say hello and welcome to the second webinar in a three-part series presented by John Burton Advocates for Youth and Fostering Academic Achievement Nationwide. This series is supported by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, the Stewart Foundation, and the Walter S. Johnson Foundation, and aims to highlight key findings on policy and practice areas critical to advancing the field of foster care and higher education. Each webinar has a corresponding brief, and you can find those documents along with the recordings of the webinar on both the JBay and FAN websites. So really quickly, we just want to highlight that today's webinar will share the findings and recommendations from a new report on how states are implementing Chafee education and training vouchers for students with experience in foster care, and where there may be opportunities to improve how these funds are utilized. The webinar will highlight findings from a survey of state ETV coordinators and will share a set of research-based best practices that states can use to help to refine how they operationalize this program to best meet the needs of students. So now let's welcome our presenters. First, we have Lori Tiller. Lori is a public service faculty member at the Fanning Institute for Leadership Development, a unit of the Office of Public Service and Outreach at the University of Georgia. She is the co-lead of the Embark Georgia Network, supporting higher education professionals as they serve in visible populations and she works on a variety of youth leadership efforts, both virtually and in person, to increase the capacity of leaders and young people from elementary through graduate school. Lori is a current PhD candidate at the Institute of Higher Education at the University of Georgia. Next, we have Debbie Voucher. Debbie currently serves as the Education Director for the John Burton Advocates for Youth. In this role, Debbie provides leadership and strategic visioning for JBay's education work and leads the agency's policy efforts designed to improve post-secondary educational outcomes for foster youth and students experiencing homelessness. Debbie has worked in the social services field for over 25 years, including extensive work in developing solutions to homelessness. And finally, we have Bree Lee. Bree is a graduate of Western Michigan University, where she majored in social work and received her master's of social work from the University of Michigan. Bree works as a behavioral health therapist and supports the FAN network as a project assistant. Welcome, everybody. So great to have you. And I am going to turn it over to you, Bree, and you can go ahead and share a little bit about yourself, and then we'll share a little bit about the project.
Yeah, so as Maddie said, my name is Bree Lee. I got my undergrad and grad school degree both in social work, and I currently work as a behavioral health therapist as well as the project assistant for FAN. I guess I'll share one thing. One thing about me is that I actually did graduate from a campus-based support program. So I have actually used all of these resources in some shape or way. So getting into kind of the research, some of the things that I noticed that I really loved and about some of the websites for the ETV is the ones that had, the best friendly design. So as a young person, it's always catchy, bright colors, clean look for me. So those kind of were the ones that were easier to stay on the website page. I love where they offered helpful tips to help you kind of apply the information. There were some that were very tech savvy where you could text and apply, and those were really great to use. I did see a couple of things that I thought were kind of challenging, if it was like outdated websites or challenges navigating. So I've applied, but then what's next kind of? And some states did a really good job of sending out a follow-up email. Okay, so you've applied, here's what's next, and others didn't have that. So that was one of the things I've noticed. The second things I've noticed is like deadlines and how clear that they're on the websites of when the deadline is to apply. And again, certain states did a really great job of that. In other states, it was kind of hard to find that. Specifically, one of the great things that I really like about Michigan, where I'm located, where I utilize the funds, is I really liked that you were able to check on the status of your application. And I think that that's a huge piece with young folks going to college, and having to keep up with so many other things already. It would just provide an easier way to kind of follow that. I love that when they had kind of what we call snapshots. So a flyer of information that kind of showed you everything that you needed. And then lastly, and the most important that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on is kind of breaking down what the funds are used for. And I didn't do that too much, but when it is there, it's really helpful. So for myself, again, I was a part of a campus-based support program. So I had a person that was able to kind of recheck behind what I thought the funds were able to be used for. And I feel like that was super helpful for me because you would think that maybe you could use it for, say, I don't know, an iClicker for a class project. But if that's not one of the things specifically on the list, then you might not be able to use it for that. And then in that same kind of spirit of using the funds for certain things, I think that could also be a barrier, right? So if folks are coming to school and needing the funds, we think about like tuition and then books and then room and board or some of the specifics that folks use it for. But we don't really think about like getting a class, getting food, other areas that folks need support in and can be better supported with these funds. So that's another, I would say, challenge that I found. But I think overall, the best ways to kind of get young people into wanting to apply for ETV and helping them make it more visible is, again, a really good website that's going to draw them in. And then the second thing is going to be kind of that youth-friendly design. Again, text is really big. I know it's a hard thing to change, but the quicker and easier a young person can kind of do it and continue, the more people that will do it. And then lastly, just identifying those champions or support people that can offer that assistance, which I know we're, growing as more campuses get support. But those are really the big things that, I would have loved to see more of. And I think that kind of the next youth coming up could use to help them better get prepared to use Chafee and ETV and to help the funds gain more visibility. Because I think there's also some folks that don't even know about the funds. So that's kind of what, my outlook was and what the reviews of the websites that I saw. And I'm going to shoot it over to Lori so that Lori can kind of go more in depth into the research and the review.
Awesome. Thanks, Bree. I appreciate that. And thanks so much for sharing your experience with that. It was really, for those of you listening, we'll talk about the methodology here in just a second. And it was really great to have Bree's viewpoint as we were looking through websites and kind of highlighting the different things. So she was a huge help as we were doing this. And so as Maddie introduced, my name is Lori Tiller, and I am at the University of Georgia. And one of the things I didn't add to that bio is we also here at UGA, we are a third party folks that manage our ETV program here in Georgia. So that was one of the reasons that I was interested in thinking about doing this to begin with. And as Maddie said, one of the things we're really interested in is finding those best practices that are working in certain states and how we can highlight and share those so other states might be able to take those on. So Maddie, if you go to the next slide, we can talk about kind of how we did it. And so we looked at all 50 states in the District of Columbia, and the 3 sites that are listed here under the website scan, which Maddie's going to put in the chat for everybody as well, were really helpful as we started navigating what folks have out there and who is managing and how they're managing their ETV implementation. And it was really interesting to kind of figure out that it's so vastly different across states, right? So there are the federal requirements that are there, and but things have been largely unchanged since about 2002. And the way that the program is managed and implemented from state to state was kind of dramatically different as we were able to find. And so we use these 3 sites to kind of help to begin with. And then you can look in the report. There's an appendix that'll show the other kind of pieces that we looked at on the websites. But what we found is there were a couple of questions that we had in addition to what we were able to find on site. So we did a second part and distributed a survey. And thanks to Bree helping us with that as well, we ended up sending it out to 117 individuals, and those were both the ETV coordinators for the state that were listed through the federal website, and then also folks that we found on websites as we did our scan. We sent 3 different reminders. And it was great. We got 24 states to respond after harassment. It was great. And we did, the respondents represented, from our calculations, about 55% of the federal funding. And the highest number of students served that we received back were from California, and our lowest number was from Vermont. And the survey responses provided some more in-depth feedback than what we were able to get on some of the websites. So as we go through the findings here, we have 7 findings to share with you. Some will be specifically from the survey, and then some will be intermixed with the web scan. So you'll be able to note that as we go through. So here we go. Finding number 1. Management of ETV programs really varies widely state by state. So we've got here what we were able to come up with on how the ETV is managed, which partner in the state is doing that. And so 25, so about half, right, were managed directly from their state child welfare agency. That's who managed the website, and that's who implements the program. Foster Care to Success, which some of you may already know about, that's 6 states right now are utilizing that organization to help. We had 7 states we were able to find that utilized another type of state agency, which was pretty interesting. And so those ranged from financial aid departments to workforce development offices to an office of the child advocate. And then 13 states we were able to find had some sort of independent or outside organization, which, as I stated in the beginning, is kind of like what we're doing here in Georgia. And so leveraging those community-based organizations seems to allow some of those states to expand the resources available to the young people. And as Bree kind of stated, helps with that, getting the word out there, right? So if it's not just from the child welfare services, it's from another entity. So they're kind of hearing it from several different places. So we thought that was interesting that it's, it's almost kind of half and half right there. So if we look at Foster Care to Success, other state agencies and outside organizations, then we've got, half child welfare and half other folks. So that was a really interesting finding. And so we've got some recommendations about that at the end as well. So our second finding was around information available on the website. So Maddie, when you get a second, if you could switch that over. And that goes to 30% of states kind of lacked clear information or had no information on their websites. And this speaks to kind of how Bree joined us in the beginning. This is where young people are going to get their information. And so it was interesting to go through those sites. And we had a rubric that we came up with for kind of very clear, clear, unclear, or no information. Close to a third had significant room for improvement, that there just wasn't a lot of information on that. There wasn't contact information, and some of the information had not been updated in recent years. We did find only 12 states did not have online ETV applications. So that was actually pretty good to note, that means the majority of states do have some form of ability to do that online. And we did find that some states required a password once the student was registered. So that would be interesting to delve a little further into that to see if that helps or hinders that young person. Students with experience in foster care are often navigating these websites without a trusted adult with them. So they need to be as clear and easy to read as possible and have all the information kind of on that first page. So this is something that we're hoping in the findings or in the recommendations that maybe there's some stuff we can improve on here. And so our third finding is that many states kind of impose additional barriers beyond what those federal eligibility requirements are. And Maddie, if you want to go ahead and flip to the next one, we've got those listed on this one for what we were able to find, and not identifying states specifically, but this was some of the extra information we were able to find. And so, generally, students with experience in foster care are eligible for ETV after the age of 14 and under the age of 23 or up to 26 in some states that chose to do that, accredited institution of higher education, and the award cannot exceed cost of attendance. So, it's a very set of basic kind of requirements at that point, but most states, while lots of states though seem to develop some extra pieces there. We found requiring a minimum duration in care. So those went anywhere from at least 30 days in care to some up to 12 months in care. There were quite a few states that required a high school diploma or GED, and submission of an application that required more information than generally Pell or a FAFSA would. Some of the applications were really, really long. They included essay questions, completion of orientation sessions. So it was really interesting to see that it wasn't uniform across all of the states. Even though the federal guidelines are the same, the states are choosing to interpret those a little differently. So we've got some recommendations around that as we move forward as well. And then our fourth finding kind of goes along with this one, is that the academic requirements that are so stringent in some of these states might limit that ETV usage. And this was one of the things we went back and forth on as we were looking for the language on the websites. We looked at language on websites, and we also asked this in our survey for how folks determine satisfactory academic progress. And it's interesting that so many states, and honestly, even institutions within states, define this very differently. So some say students must maintain SAP, the satisfactory academic progress. Lots of states, though, offer also that the student needs to maintain that 2.0 GPA, which is not the same thing as SAP for several schools. And then there were lots of schools and websites that talked about the terms progress towards degree, with no specific details as to what that meant for the young person. So as Bree kind of set us up in the very beginning there, right? So we have the student apply, but we don't necessarily always say what that means once that happens. So they've applied and they're in school. And so what does this do? And then we had quite a few websites and then folks that just didn't have that information on there. But we do know from a report last year that John Burton put out was that 1/3 of students with experience in foster care don't often meet their institution's SAP standards. So what does this mean for the young person once they haven't met that SAP standard? And then how will they be eligible for their financial aid to continue in school that semester? So the differences in eligibility were also around part-time versus full-time students, and looking at what does it actually mean to say progress to a degree? And so how is that different? Because there were some institutions that was different, not only institution to institution across a state, but it was also different within programs within that institution. So it's a lot for a young person to navigate. Finding 5, this is where we got into kind of the differences around how students receive their funding. And so more than half of the states require students to verify expenses as a condition of paying, utilizing their ETV. And so, you know, that means that students are really, the burden is there to provide receipts, lease agreements, all kinds of information to make sure they're able to utilize that ETV up to that cost of attendance, and then if they're eligible for any sort of stipends. But one thing we found is that, you know, we all know the costs of everything have gone up, you know, so in 2003, ETV funds covered approximately 50% of the average cost of tuition, while though in 2017, and that was even a few years ago at this point, funds covered only approximately 21% of tuition costs. And so that doesn't address any of those non-tuition costs, right? Housing, food, transportation, childcare. So there's a lot more that goes into it. And so of the respondents we had of the survey, 52% indicated that they were required to provide that extra verification, which is different than students who are eligible for Pell, right? You get your Pell and there's not extra things to have to do. So this practice may create some additional barriers. And while we understand, you know, there does need to be, you know, the checks and balances, all of that, we've got some recommendations for maybe how that could be a little bit different, or some practices that states could try and do. All right, and then finding 6. One of the things we looked at is the disconnect between states' perception of their ability to meet their local need and the number of students who do not receive funding. And so this was something that we looked at in a couple of different ways. And so the funding for the ETV program was initiated in 2001 and is authorized in law for $60 million annually. Actual appropriations have never really reached that threshold. And in FY 2020, funding for the ETV program was $43.3 million. ETV funds are distributed to states based on the proportion of the state's children in foster care, and states must provide at least a 20% match or receive their allotment. So we did find that there are states that may give more than their 20% match, and then there are the states that do their 20%, and then there were some states that didn't respond to that piece of the survey. They were asked if they were able to serve all eligible students. 18 of the 24 states answered yes, that they were able to serve all eligible students. However, some did indicate that they were able to serve them at less than the amount that they were able to receive. They weren't able to give the students their $5,000. So there's some disconnects in how we're doing that. So in some cases, the ability to serve all eligible students might just be the result of the states being able to contribute more or less, more than that 20%. And there's probably some more information we're going to need on figuring this out. But if we look at just the number of students receiving and then those that are eligible, there's quite a gap there as we look. And so we've got some recommendations coming up on how we can consider that. And so if you look in the report in the opening section, there's some extra information there on kind of how we came to those numbers. So that's something you can go back and look at. And then finding 7 was, we also noticed from websites and information given to us, was that many states link their ETV funding to additional student supports, which can both be good and bad. As Bree said, there's barriers and successes for each of those things, but a lot of them were related to case management services that could come from accessing your ETV. Students will receive some form of coaching if they're receiving their ETV services. And then most of those that responded to that indicated that the services were not necessarily mandatory, and that they were general kind of independent living resources that were opportunities for the students to have. Researchers often, right, and a lot of what we see, notice that in addition to these funds being, funding money, that we also want to combine the money with some services for students, because that adult relationship is really important to provide for that young person. So it was interesting, the websites that we're linking, in addition to the tuition or the ETV, some states also link their tuition waiver to this. And then some states also, as Bree mentioned at the beginning, attending a campus support program, that campus support programs are some options that are also available on some of these websites. So it was really great to see that the ones that offered this as extra information were offering it, but it was not mandatory to receive that ETV. And I think that was kind of the takeaway for that. So those are, in a flash, the 7 findings that we're looking at right now. And then I think I'm going to kick it to Debbie to talk about some of the state and federal recommendations that we came up with from these.
Excuse me. Thanks so much, Lori. A couple things just before I get started. If folks have questions, please do go ahead and submit them through the Q&A function. And we will, we'll make sure to leave some time at the end for any kind of questions or comments that people want to share through the Q&A. And, really appreciative to be partnering with Lori and Maddie on this effort. And the recommendations that I'm going to be sharing, you'll see some very direct linkages between the findings that Lori just shared and what the recommendations are. So there's some pretty clear connections there. So, if you are somebody who is actually administering the Chafee ETV program in your state, then, these recommendations will be very relevant to you. However, if you're not that person, what I would encourage you to think about as we're walking through these recommendations is where there might be opportunities for you as a stakeholder in your state to advocate, to, communicate these recommendations to those who do have control over making these decisions. So even if you're not the decision maker yourself, please know that you can play a role and you can help move these forward in your own state. So I'm going to be talking first about some state level recommendations and then share some recommendations for what we think could happen federally to make this program more accessible for more students. So the first recommendation for states, and as Lori mentioned, there is a lot of discretion that states have about how they implement this program. And one thing that Lori did share about is the fact that there are a lot of states who the delivery mechanism for the funding looks pretty different from how other forms of financial aid are distributed. So what I'm talking about in particular is that when a student receives, say, a Pell Grant, typically that money comes to the campus and the campus will deduct any money that might be owed for tuition or on-campus housing. And then anything that's remaining is given to the student in cash, either as a check or an electronic deposit. And the student, then has discretion to determine how they want to use those funds. Now, what we found, as Lori described, in some states, rather than distributing the money that way, states require students to either provide receipts for specific types of expenses. They limit, exactly what the money can and can't be used for, or they might require that the funds be dispersed to a third-party vendor, rather than just giving the student the funds directly and giving them discretion to spend the money how they see fit on the various costs that are associated with being able to go to college. So, this really creates a situation where foster youth are being held to a very different standard about the financial aid that they're receiving than any other students who are receiving other forms of financial aid. It also creates barriers. Not all costs are easily verifiable. It's not always easy to get receipts or, to put the money up front before you can get reimbursed. And so we really encourage states to look at this practice as if this is something that you're doing in your state, and think about whether you could move towards a system of dispersing funds that does align more to other forms of financial aid, like, for example, the Pell Grant, where students really are given the trust and have the discretion to use the money, for whatever expenses, whether that's paying for rent or childcare or food, but that, they have the discretion to use those funds in the way that they see fit. So that's our first recommendation. The second recommendation is removing, actually, we're still on the same slide, removing eligibility barriers. So Lori talked pretty extensively about some of the eligibility requirements that the scan did reveal beyond the federal eligibility requirements. And so we believe that this program should be made available to as many students as possible. And, of course, as Lori talked about, the amount of funding that's made available for the program doesn't align to the need. And so there are going to be circumstances where states will need to prioritize students simply because the program is oversubscribed. But the recommendation is to, as much as possible, not impose these additional eligibility requirements that go beyond what's in federal law. In particular, things like, some of the things that were found were, as Lori mentioned, requiring students to submit an application that includes writing essays as part of the application, or there was some that required students to apply for private scholarships as a condition of receiving ETV. And those types of eligibility criteria can exclude the students with the greatest level of need. Those students for whom writing those kinds of essays or applying for scholarships or that type of thing is going to be a barrier. And so imposing those types of requirements really means that the funding isn't necessarily going to the students whose need is the greatest. In addition, imposing requirements like having to have been in foster care for at least 6 months or at least 1 year or something like that, some of those can be a little bit arbitrary. That those types of requirements aren't necessarily indicative of where the need is the greatest. And so the more that states, to the extent that they do have to ration the benefit, do so in a way that looks at maybe what the unmet need is in the financial aid package, rather than these more kind of arbitrary requirements like age in care or length of time in care. So we can go to the next slide. The other recommendation is maximizing outreach and awareness. So Lori talked about this disconnect that we found where the funding, it really only funds about 15% of the eligible population, and yet there were a large number of states who reported in the surveys that they were able to serve all of the foster youth who were requesting funding. And so that really did raise a question about what's going on there, that states think that they're serving all of their students when the data shows that there's probably a lot of students in that state who could qualify who are not receiving an award. And so part of that could be that states maybe could be doing more robust outreach, and that there are students out there who aren't receiving the award and the state isn't aware of them because they're not applying, because they don't know about the existence of the program. And so connecting with community-based organizations is a great way to get the word out, really working with the community and with stakeholders to make sure that information is being shared far and wide about the availability of the program. Bree already talked, very articulately about websites and the need for websites that are student friendly. And the report does include in one of the appendices a list of some websites that our evaluation found to be, meet these criteria. And so, we would encourage you to take a look at that. If your current website maybe isn't as laid out, in the sort of the way that Bree described, to kind of take a look and see where you might make it a little more student friendly and clearer for young people who might be interested in getting information about the program. The next recommendation also is on this slide is about academic progress requirements. So again, Lori shared a bit about the findings where lots of variation in this. What the federal law says is that states have to have some sort of standard to gauge whether students are making progress towards a degree. But the federal law doesn't define what that looks like. And so, as Lori mentioned, we did find a lot of variation. In some cases, it was the institution's satisfactory academic progress standard, which is what's used for federal financial aid. In others, maybe it was a GPA standard. The more flexibility that states can provide around this requirement, the more accessible the program will be. And as Lori mentioned, my organization, John Burton Advocates for Youth, did do a very extensive study where we looked at the rates of failure to meet satisfactory academic progress standards within California's community college system, although other research has found similar numbers. And so I think that the research we found in California is going to be applicable pretty much in any state across the country. And a third of students with experience in foster care failed to make SAP in their first year. And so when the Chafee ETV program in the state is linked to that same standard, or imposes a requirement that if a student doesn't have a 2.0 GPA after the first year, they lose eligibility for the program, that's a really significant proportion of students who will lose access to the program as a result. And what other research has found is that the difference between a student who makes SAP and a student who doesn't make SAP is not about whether that student is motivated or even about whether they have the academic chops to be successful in school. It's really about access to resources, barriers, students who have to work full-time, students who are single parents, students who have been in the foster care system, experience homelessness. These are all the students who are more likely to fail SAP. And so when we impose these strict academic standards, what happens is the students who come in with the greatest level of need and the most barriers are then further penalized as a result of that through the loss of financial aid. And the great news about the ETV program is that it doesn't have to be linked to the Pell Grant standards. There is flexibility that states have. And so the recommendation is that states take a look at those policies and see where they can offer flexibility. And I'll just offer an example here in California. We recently enacted a law to create a new standard for academic progress specifically for the ETV program. And what it does is it allows the student to actually receive an award for up to 2 years before they lose access because of SAP, as opposed to the 1-year requirement linked to the Pell Grant. The way the law is structured is if a student fails to make SAP for their first 2 consecutive terms, they do have to meet with a counselor and create a plan to improve academic progress, which is not just the academic plan, but really looking more holistically at what is going on in that student's life and what can be put in place to better support that student. So they do have to complete that plan in order to continue to receive the award in the second year. But once they do that, they can continue to receive the award even when they've lost other federal financial aid. And what we have started to see, it's a new law, so we don't have a lot of data on it yet, but what we've started to see is that what that enables a student to do is by continuing to receive the ETV grant, even if they've lost, say, their Pell Grant, it allows them to enroll in enough courses to bring their GPA back up or their course completion rate back up so that they can regain standing and then continue to receive the Pell Grant or other forms of financial aid again. We can go to the next slide. So those are our 4 key state level recommendations. I'm going to move to some federal level recommendations. The truth is, I think anybody who watches the news knows that getting things to move at the federal level is challenging. That being said, the issue of students who with experience in foster care has long been a bipartisan issue with a lot of support on both sides of the aisle. And so, I think that there definitely could be opportunities to make changes at the federal level to this program to better support the needs of these students. And so I'll just walk through what those are. So the biggest one is more money. All of the recommendations that I just talked about at the state level, and then I'm going to talk about at the federal level, are really designed to give more students access to the program. We know that they're out there. We know that these students who meet the eligibility criteria exist. We want them to have access to the program. Research has shown that students are significantly more likely to stay enrolled and complete college when they do have access to ETV funding. We know that it works. And so we want as many students with experience in foster care to have access to this resource. And if we remove eligibility barriers and we do expand the number of students who gain access to the program, that of course increases the cost. And so that's the first recommendation, is more money for the program. And right now, as Lori mentioned, the program is authorized at up to 60 million. The existing funding is only about 43.3 million. Our recommendation is that the program funding go up to $100 million annually. Wouldn't necessarily meet 100% of the need, but it would certainly go a lot further than the $43.3 million that's available currently. So that's the first recommendation. Truth is, the federal budget is ginormous. I don't even know what it is now, but it's $100 million is kind of a rounding error in the federal budget. So I think it's very doable if there's a political will to get more money for this program. The second recommendation, and I'll just say one other thing from my experience in California with this, is that here in California, we do have pretty broad eligibility criteria and do a lot of outreach for this program. And our experience has been that the federal allocation plus the 20% required match here in California allows us to provide awards to about 1,500 students. We have an additional 4,000 students who cannot be served through that federal funding plus the state match. So we certainly here in California have seen that the funding is definitely inadequate to the needs. So I think it's a good case study to show that when eligibility criteria are limited to mostly the federal requirements and outreach is done on a robust way, that the students are out there and that the need does exist. The second recommendation on the federal level is to increase the amount of the award cap. So it's currently capped at $5,000. There was a brief period due to some pandemic related changes where states were given some additional funding and were allowed to raise the maximum award to up to $12,000. That was temporary. It's now back down to the $5,000 cap. And this $5,000 cap has been in place since the inception of the program. And so it has never been adjusted for inflation. Exacerbating that is the fact that the cost of attending college has actually increased more than general inflation. So one study found that between 2007, 2008 through 2017, 2018, so that 10-year period, prices for tuition fees, room and board at public institutions rose by 31% after adjustment for inflation. So big increases to the cost of attending college, and yet the award amount for ETV has remained at $5,000. Now, of course, if the award amount were to increase, the maximum award amount, that would absolutely require more money into the program. There's not a lot of point in increasing the maximum award amount to $12,000 without more funding for the program as well. So those two things would have to go hand in hand. Another just point to support this is that the average cost of attendance at public institutions, it ranges from about $18,000 to about $26,000, depending on where the institution is and the type of institution. The current maximum Pell Grant award is about $6,500. And so some of that gap can be filled in if there's state programs or private scholarships, but there's still a really big gap between $20,000 cost of attendance and a $6,500 Pell Grant. And so we really want to make sure that students with experience in foster care can come out of college debt-free and that they can focus on their studies and don't have to work while they're enrolled. And so making sure that the funding that's made available meets the full unmet need is really crucial for that to be able to happen. We can go to the next slide. So the next recommendation, and this you'll see is very kind of parallels the recommendations that we offered to states, which is to enact rules that more closely align to Pell Grant standards. So rather than let states make these decisions to require receipts or issuings of payment to third parties and that type of thing, to actually at the federal level create a standard that aligns how the funding is dispersed to how Pell Grant monies are dispersed. A couple of other ways that would be helpful to align this program more closely to Pell Grant standards would be to increase the award duration from the current 5 years to 6 years, which is what Pell Grants are available for, as well as to remove the age cap. So right now, students can only receive an award up to age 23 if they're in a state without extended foster care, or up to age 26 if a state has opted to expand it and has extended foster care in their state. Now, again, this is another one of these changes that would have to be accompanied by additional federal dollars. To expand the number of students who qualify for the program, more money would be necessary. Otherwise, you're just moving the money around from one student to a different student. And then again, creating more flexible academic progress standards. So this is something that states could do, but this is also something that could actually be included in federal law so that all states have the same standard related to satisfactory academic progress, as I've talked about previously. And I'll just note one other thing about the SAP study that we did, which is in addition to finding a third of foster youth, or a third of youth with experience in foster care not making SAP, there were also disparities across different subpopulations. We disaggregated based on race and ethnicity, and the percentage of foster youth, of students with experience in foster care who don't make SAP, who are African American, was double that of white students. And so again, by creating a more flexible SAP standard, we're really supporting equity goals related to this population. And in fact, a full 42% of African American students with experience in foster care in our community college system were losing their financial aid, which is just a huge number. And so really just underscores the need to really look at this issue of SAP. If we can go to the next slide. So the next recommendation is ensuring accountability. So right now, there's very little data that states have to submit about this program. They basically just have to provide the total number of awards made and the number of new awards made, and that's it. And so it's really hard to know much about how this program is functioning based on that data. So the next recommendation would be to require all jurisdictions that receive an ETV allocation to provide some additional metrics to the Children's Bureau, and that data be made publicly available. So the report kind of outlines some ideas for what could be collected, the number of students who are applying, the number of awards actually made, the number of applicants who are rejected, and the reasons for those rejections would be really helpful to understand, and what the average award amount is to see if states are having to reduce their award amounts because of lack of funding. To monitor for equity considerations, we also recommend that all of those same metrics be disaggregated by race and ethnicity and gender to see where there might be disparities. And then last but not least, the last recommendation would be for the Children's Bureau to create a community of practice for ETV administrators that would include both administrators both inside and outside of child welfare. So as Lori shared at the beginning, some states administer their ETV programs through their child welfare agencies, others contract with another kind of state agency, others still contract with a community-based organization. And regardless of what entity is administering the program, we think that everybody could benefit from learning from one another about best practices, what's working, what's not working, brainstorm together. And I know that there have been efforts to bring together the child welfare folks specifically who manage ETV programs, I think those efforts maybe have stalled out a little bit, probably because of pandemic issues. But bringing back that and incorporating opportunities for administrators outside of child welfare to share knowledge and expertise, I think can be a great way to have the practices that are working more broadly disseminated across states. That is it for recommendations. I think the next slide is just concluding thoughts, which I'll just reiterate what I said at the beginning, which is even if you yourself are not a state administrator of ETV, there may be opportunities for you to have conversations and share this information with those who do administer the program in your state to see whether, even if you can't implement every single one of these recommendations, maybe there's some of them or part of them that your state might be willing to consider to make this program more broadly accessible. And I'll turn it back over to Lori to see if she has any concluding thoughts, as well as Bree.
I was, of course, on mute when I did that. So thanks, Debbie. Yeah, I'm excited about some of these recommendations. It was very interesting to get to look at all of this. And so I'm really hopeful. I completely agree with Debbie that even if you were not the state person in charge of this, advocating for that will really help in your state and bringing those community-based organizations together. And Bree, I would really love to hear your final thoughts kind of after hearing all of this, and if anything has kind of come up as you've maybe been perusing the Q&A in the chat as well.
Yeah, so I think some really great points were brought on by you and Debbie. I can't help but think like these are huge, recommendations that are going to take a lot of effort and a lot of teamwork, and that's why we're here today. And so I just think about like the little stuff that helped me, right? I know it's like young people always pushing easier things, but really just helping with visibility of, a bright website or a text option, or, even starting off with the smaller things if we, if it's going to take a little bit of time to kind of get up to those bigger recommendations. I think 90% of that was in line with some of the experiences I had. And so I'm just really excited to kind of hear some of the questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Bree. And I think with that, we turn it to Maddie. Is that true?
Yes. Hello, everybody. So great to be back with you all. So we have lots of questions, and I will just say in the 13 minutes that we have, we'll do our best to get through them. So just wanted to start off. We have a question from Matthew, who asked, how does participation and use of ETVs vary state by state based on strictness of their eligibility requirement or eligibility criteria? So, do states with lower percentage of youth using ETV have higher eligibility requirement? Was there any looking into that?
I would say short answer, we did not look at that through the survey. I'd have to go back and see if there was some information that we could compare between websites, but we didn't look at that. But I am going to write that one down because that would be interesting to look at given the recommendation on that.
Yeah.
And I'll just add that the Urban Institute is working on a study right now, and they have access to a lot more data than we had. They can actually get, state level data around usage that we didn't have access to. So I'm hoping that that's something that their research might also have an opportunity to look at.
Yeah. So we have a question. This is from an anonymous person who asked, do you have a recommended level of funding that should be provided per student? As you noted, ETV doesn't cover as much as it used to. What level of funding per student should be provided to keep pace with the cost of higher education?
So I can respond to that. I think as we shared within the recommendations, we think the cap should be increased to $12,000. Now, that doesn't mean that every student would receive $12,000. The amount that they receive is going to be based on the cost of attendance and the unmet need based on other forms of financial aid that they're receiving. But having a cap that is that high, we think would go pretty far in terms of allowing students to not, as I said, have to either take out loans or work full time to be able to afford college. So that would be our recommended amount. As I mentioned, that would require more funding from the federal government in order to do that. But that is our recommendation. And I'll just note, I just want to say that I misspoke about when the $12,000 cap expires. It's actually still in place right now. States can still provide grants up to that amount. It does expire on September 30th, 2022.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I also just want you guys to know, several people asked about the about research about ETV's impact on graduation outcomes. And so I dropped a link that Lori shared with a couple of you into the chat just regarding some research out of the Cal Youth study. Wonderful. All right. So another question was asked, is it legal for states to add additional requirements at the state level, such as requiring a student to have been in foster care for a specific duration? It doesn't seem consistent with federal eligibility criteria.
That's such a good question. I had the same question. I mean, it would be a question that I'd have to direct to somebody at the Children's Bureau. I don't want to interpret federal law. I mean, I guess I'd say my assumption as we were doing this research is that they must be allowed to, because they do. And so many states do. So, the way the current statute is written, I don't think requires states to, it doesn't require states to provide funding to all eligible students because it's not an entitlement award like Pell Grant where everybody who qualifies gets it. There's a limited amount of money that states get. And so they do have to make choices about who's going to get the money and who's not. And some states do that on a first come, first served basis, and others establish limiting eligibility criteria.
Mm-hmm. So another question that will likely go to you, Debbie. So somebody asked about a bill that you described, and they said, was there resistance from the child welfare system or higher education about the bill Debbie described? Did people see it as lowering the bar? How was the outcome? And I believe this is related to the SAP adjustment.
Yeah, I mean, we're very fortunate here in California. I will say that, we have a legislature that really views their role through an equity perspective on the whole. And, there's a real recognition of the challenges that this particular population face and a strong desire to see the outcomes improve. And so we were just fortunate here. I would say we didn't get a lot of pushback around kind of the lowering the bar. And I certainly have heard that argument made. And I think, we of course would rather see students not failing SAP. That's preferred. And we've done a lot of work here in California around making sure that the supports that are made available are as robust as possible. But there is a certain reality that for a lot of students, especially in that first year, it's a big transition coming into a college environment, or maybe they don't get good advising. There's all kinds of reasons why they might fail SAP. And so, if anybody is interested in pursuing something similar in their state, please do reach out to me, because I can share. We have lots of materials that we put together to make the case for this that I'd be happy to share.
Great. We have a question from Daisha about the max age limit. So they ask, is there a max age limit? For example, youth who are in care at 16 and are now in their 20s, but would like to apply for ETV. And if a youth applies at the max age limit for ETV, could they still receive the award for 4 years, given if they're attending a four-year university? Trying to confirm if an individual could receive the award at 30 if they apply at 26.
They can't. If they apply, if they're in a state that goes up to age 26, it's actually up till their 26th birthday. So if they apply and they're 25 years old and they get the award, they only get it for 1 year. They can't keep getting it after the age is passed.
Yeah, great. I feel like, sometimes it can get hard to follow all of the different requirements, understanding for different funding streams, but that's very helpful. So we have a question from Mary.
Sorry, can I just add one thing? Because I just noticed in the chat that Catherine Heath.
I was just going to jump in. Yeah.
Okay. So Catherine is with the Children's Bureau. And so I just want to read what she said. And she said, Debbie is correct. Yay. States can add additional requirements. It isn't an entitlement. But I agree, states should look at why their requirements are there, for what purpose. Just wanted to pass that along.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Catherine, for weighing in. So we have a question from Mary Ellen. They ask, can you speak to sharing of FAFSA information, which can help to identify eligible students? And I don't know, Lori, if you want to take that one as you work directly with an ETV program.
Yeah, I can, and I can share our experience from Georgia. Is it's very dependent upon how that student has released their information from the time that they were transitioning from high school into college. And so that is also going to be on a state by state basis, how that works and how your data sharing agreements work between your post-secondary system and your K-12 system. So it's possible you just may need to check in on how that is set up in your state. And Debbie, I'm not sure if you want to weigh in from the California side of things.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely, I'm not sure I fully understand the question. So I do think that there can be opportunities for ETV administrators to work with their state financial aid administrators to get information about who's indicated that they are that they qualify for independent status based on their experience in foster care, and do outreach specifically to those students about the availability of funding. We also in California, our process is very linked to the FAFSA, and the amount of funding that is made available is based directly on the information that comes through the FAFSA in terms of unmet need.
Mm-hmm. So Debbie, I have a question from Carol that might follow up on that. So Carol asked, Debbie, given how many ETV students can't be served in California, does the state prioritize who gets an award in any way, or is it basically a first come, first served situation?
We do prioritize. It's a bit of a complicated prioritization system. I hope I get this correct. I can't remember the exact order of things, but I think that it is students with dependents, so students who are parents, get first priority. Then students who are in their last year of eligibility get prioritized over students who are younger. And then it's prioritized by students with the greatest level of unmet need, so based on financial need. And then after that, it's first come, first serve, kind of within those categories. So it's a little bit complicated how we do it here, but we do have that system.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from Kristen who asks, has there been any research about whether the 12K pandemic number improved persistence or anything else? I think any other, outcomes regarding that.
So I actually responded to her in the chat briefly that we're at this point looking at that in Georgia. I'm not sure that it's been looked at nationally at this point because not as many students would have kind of persisted through yet, but that is something that we're hoping to be able to look at in our next year's report. I'm not sure, Debbie, if you guys have looked at that in California yet or not.
We have not. That funding is still so new. I don't think there's really been an opportunity, but hopefully there will be some research that gets done.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we have a question from Brandy. They ask, have you considered that of the 1/3 that didn't meet SAP, they may not have really wanted post-secondary as a goal, but had no other option, or went to another option like extended foster care or aftercare type services. And then I think it says to pursue another qualifying activity.
So the research has consistently shown that about 90% of youth with experience in foster care indicate a desire to go to college and to receive a credential. And so, that's not just been in one study. I mean, that's been shown over and over and over again. So based on that, my impression from the data is that that this is a goal for the vast majority of youth with experience in the foster care system. And there's a really great research study that we cite in our report. There was a qualitative study that looked at the difference between students who make SAP and students who don't. And it wasn't specific to students with experience in foster care, but it was very interesting and and really demonstrated that the differences were not about desire. They really weren't. And so I don't see any reason why that would be different for students with experience in foster care than other students. And so the research that is out there really doesn't support that as being what really is underlying that SAP disparity.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Debbie. Well, we are just about at time, and so I want to get everybody out of here on time. Please make sure to find our new report at the links that have been dropped in chat. Don't forget to register for our third and final webinar in this series. We've provided that link in chat. And finally, we know we didn't get to all of your questions, but you're welcome to reach out to us, and you can find us at our various emails, which we have also dropped in chat. Thank you all so much for joining us for a wonderful presentation, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.